Well, kia ora, everyone. We've just had a wonderful session, probably not as good as the Pharmac session, to be honest, but because, but we were competitive. And we had a wonderful session on education, and now we're changing direction a little bit. And I've got two Slidos, so we should probably have twice as many questions. I want to welcome the panel, first of all. It's an interesting time for the environment in the current world. So that's sort of the topic of today. We have three wonderful participants in this area. Firstly, to my immediate left is Penny Nelson, who's the Director General of the Department of Conservation. Penny, thank you very much for joining us. So Penny is responsible for managing about a third of New Zealand's land area. So that's a pretty straightforward proposition. And we're going to talk to her about the environment generally, but also the challenges the DOC faces, which would be good. James Shaw needs no introduction, the Honourable James Shaw, who is now listed as a strategic consultant. Wonderful thing. Former Minister for Climate Change, co-leader of the Greens for 9 years, and served as Minister for Climate Change for 6 years. James, of course, championed the Zero Carbon Act and reformed the emissions trading scheme, and he's involved in a number of climate and environmental organisations and businesses in his current role. And down the end there, Veronica Jacobsen is Director of Sapere. I worked with Veronica when she was at MB. Veronica is an economist specialising in the economic analysis of law. She's a Director of Sapere, and a particular focus on developing to build the policy and economics capability of public servants, which is a topical subject in the last couple of days. So we're here to talk about the environment, and I don't think we can talk about it without looking at what's happening in the wider world. And I was thinking about this, and we had a couple of chats with a couple of panel members. It seems that the consensus on public policy approach to climate change particularly, but the environment generally, was always fragile. And in the current environment, it's been a bit blown to bits around the world. You've got the Americans moving away from Paris. You've got a general economic sense of, it's all about multilateralism is in retreat. It's all about how my country gets to do better, and it's not just Trump in that regard. There's a lot of countries that are taking that approach. So where do things sit? Where are we with the environment? Is it being trampled in the economic rush? What's going on at the moment? Perhaps, James, if I start with you.
Thanks, Stephen. I'll start with the domestic and then go to the
sure
to the international, because if the question is around the trade-offs, people say, well, what trade-off are we willing to make to save the environment, versus the economy, right? And the view that I take is, well, we're already making that trade-off. So, for example, if you live in Canterbury, we're, trading off access to fresh drinking water and the ability to swim in our rivers versus baby formula exports, right, and have been for some time. If you're living in the kind of central North Island or Fiordland, we're trading off canopy collapse and the loss of our old growth native forests versus things like the ability to continue shooting mammals. And when it comes to climate change, which is the area that I know best, we're trading off, food security, national security, global security in about 20 years' time, versus the ability to drive twin cab utes today, right? So the trade-offs are already being made, and then the question is, at what point does that become so painful that we do something differently? And I think that's kind of where the global tension sort of is that it's the desire, the kind of, well, we'd like to save the environment. It seems nice, but, like money's a bit tight and maybe we could save it later, which we kind of go through these fits and starts, or the kind of pushback of needing to do something differently from what we're doing today and kind of going, well, actually, we quite like what we're doing today. So, that's where a lot of that tension is. I'm actually remarkably quite sanguine about Trump and Paris and so on, because We survived the American withdrawal from Paris once before. And during that period of time, the United States actually hit its climate targets in spite of all of his efforts to reverse out of renewables and get into fossil fuels, because the economics were so compelling that the Americans kind of reduced their emissions in line with their targets anyway. It's just kind of happened. My one caveat is that this version of Trump is different from the previous version, and in the meantime, there's been there's the kind of backwash from COVID and so on and so forth, combined with the sort of permission space that the first Trump presidency created. So now you've got other countries like, Argentina and various parts of Europe and so on who are saying, well, maybe we should also pull out of Paris. At that point, things really do start to...
It's becoming a discussion here.
Sorry?
I mean, if you spend 5 minutes on social media, it's a discussion here. It's sort of like, Trump pulled out, why haven't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. You can see bits of it here. By the way, I don't think you should spend any time on social media.
You don't think I should?
No,
why is it particularly bad for me?
It's particularly bad for everyone and democracy. So, yeah.
That's a good rabbit hole for us to go down as a panel. We'll come back to the environment. Let's deal with social media. Very good points. Veronica, if I could come to you next.
Well, I think James has highlighted some of the changes that are happening globally in terms of flip-flops around climate change. Things like the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. I mean, we've seen them in New Zealand too. Is agriculture in or out of the ETS?
It's never been a flip-flop. It's only ever out.
Oh. Point taken.
Sorry.
I had my train of thought. So people think about the costs and benefits they face, but that's not all they actually think about. It's the perception of the costs and benefits that's really important. And I think we ignore psychology at our peril, and how people interpret what the costs and benefits are is really important. So, for example, we tend to discount the future quite a lot. And we see now that, in fact, there's a disjunct between older people and younger people in terms of what they think about climate change. That the younger people who are thinking much more about climate change and are much more prepared to accept some of those trade-offs, because they will bear the cost in the long run if we don't. So people also think about the fact that there's status quo bias in our cognitive thinking. So we tend to favour the status quo because the future's scary and we don't know what that will be. Now, yesterday we heard a couple of throwaway lines amongst the presenters on things like nuclear. So, and there was a bit of a titter around the room as that was mentioned, because New Zealand's well entrenched in thinking about, nuclear is not an option for us. But is that really the case? Is that something we need to think about? So the status quo has biased us in one direction. So I think we need to think very clearly about the cognitive biases that we have when we're thinking about climate change.
This is already a great panel, because 10 minutes in we're discussing nuclear. And I thought we'd be at least 3/4 of the way through before we got to that. But therefore, how much has really changed? Because actually, over history, we're all subject to our own sense of our own mortality, for what it's worth.
Yes.
Yeah, the younger ones see more into the future. The older ones see more of what they used to, and they want to see more of what they used to. And if I want to hunt in a forest in Fiordland, then, because that's what I always did and that's what my dad did, then to some extent we're dealing with human nature, aren't we? And Penny, you're dealing with it every day with the conservation estate. So what's your take on the state of the environment vis-a-vis all the other pressures that are going on in terms of the political discourse, I suppose?
So in terms of the political discourse, there's a huge focus on economic growth, as you know, and I think one of the things that we sometimes don't think enough about is our natural assets are critical for economic growth. So we've just had NZIER doing some work for DOC, and the natural and physical capital of public conservation land is worth 134 billion. Our national parks have an economic value of 12.6 billion, and we get 11 billion of ecosystem services from public conservation land. So that's a really critical asset that we need to think about as we're thinking about economic growth. In terms of the trade-offs that you're talking about, 10 years ago when I worked at Business New Zealand, I was lucky enough to work with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and at the time they were doing work with Johan Rockström, and what they were trying to work through as a business community with scientists was how far can you trade off the environment until you get into thresholds where it's so risky you are going to have problems. And globally we've overshot on biodiversity, and when James was Minister we did that assessment in New Zealand, and we've overshot here on biodiversity. So I think we have really traded off the environment for economic growth. And at DOC, we've recently just done, we're developing up a conservation investment approach, and we've put together what we're investing in ecosystem, species and threats. And at the moment, with the investment we've got, we can only focus on preventing losses. We're only investing in 15% of the outcomes we need to get as a country. If we want to get to healthy nature, we're needing to get to 1.5 to 1.8 billion per year to protect it. So I think we've really got to think about if we want to have economic growth, we've got to understand nature as an asset, and we've got to be really clear on having the analytics, so as decision makers make decisions on those trade-offs, they've got really good information about what they're trading off and the consequence.
And we'll come to DOC's situation in a moment, so great to get in early with a bid. But the average punter looks out the window, I think, and sees the national parks, and they look about right. They're lovely, everybody loves them, by extension, they're part of who we are. They don't see the problem, and it's a bit like climate change, right? You can either see a storm and say to yourself, well, that's not climate change, we've had storms like that before, or you can see it as a problem, and that's sort of part of the issue, isn't it? It doesn't appear visually to people.
So I think it is starting to. So for example, we're New Zealand's biggest tourism provider as well, and we're now spending 5 times more than we were 4 years ago on storm damage. And I can tell you what, New Zealand has really cared about us getting Cathedral Cove open for Christmas.
Yes, sir.
When those bridges went out on the Heaphy, the regional economic impact on the West Coast was major. So people really care about those things. And I also think people really care about what's happening with our species. So earlier in the week, I had the most phenomenal experience down in the Reese Valley. We were releasing takahe back into the wild, and an incredible community and business and iwi effort with DOC to make that happen. And what I saw is New Zealanders know that we are losing species, and they really care about getting in behind us ensuring that we don't lose them.
I think that's definitely true. If you point to the takahe, I mean, who doesn't want to save the takahe? That's the reality of it, right? But more broadly, there's still plenty of people, and I'm going to look at James now, who's say, well, yeah, we're small, what we're 0.1 or 0.2%, depending on the day that it's said, of the world's emissions. We can't do much anyway. China's opening, China's always opening heaps of coal-fired power stations, apparently. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's certainly the folklore. And so we're dreaming, in the immortal words of the castle. Tell him he's dreaming. And so what can we do really? I mean, fatalism is a significant part of why we don't do stuff.
Well, I think fatalism is a kind of a consequence, right? It is that we kind of look at it and think, oh, it's so overwhelming, let's just party, right? Yeah. Rather than a cause, so I think it's symptomatic rather than causal. And again, I think there is a difference between kind of the local and the kind of global. I was down doing the Holyford a couple of weeks back. And it is absolutely stunning, but you can also see where the canopy has been, the understory has been kind of eaten away by, deer and goats and so on and so forth. And you really notice the difference between those areas and the areas where it's heavily trapped and you've got kind of bird song and so on that you don't have in a lot of the rest of the forest. But you can also see the consequences, right? Because when you lose the understory in the forest, it loses its ability to sequester water. And that means that you get surface flooding, which means that you get these huge slips and massive erosion and so on. So I think you are getting to the point where the kind of consequences are starting to be kind of visible to the human eye. The parts where you kind of get these large herds of deer going through, you can see through the forest. The parts where you're walking through track and there aren't a lot of deer around, you can't see more than a few meters because the undergrowth is so thick. So there are kind of those visible things, and of course the issue is that most of us don't, thank God, live in Fiordland, because we would just destroy it if we did, but we don't have those sort of tangible kind of experiences. So I think human nature and cognitive biases do play a massive role. When it comes to the kind of global issue around climate change, you're right. We are sort of under 1% of global emissions. But the thing that I always say is, we have the same population as Los Angeles, right? 5.5 million people. So if we say, well, actually, we're too small to make a difference, what we're saying is, Los Angeles, you don't need to make a difference either. And if Los Angeles doesn't need to make a difference, well, neither does New York or Chicago or Houston, also known as the United States, right? Which is one of the largest emitters in the world, right? We're kind of one component. And if you add up all of the countries, there are 90 countries in the world which individually emit less than 1% of the total. But collectively, we emit 30% of the total, those 90 countries, which is more than China, more than the United States, more than the European Union, more than India. So, I don't buy the argument.
I think, logically we can agree with. But you would know more than anybody else, given your work in politics, that it's a hard argument to win with the broad middle of New Zealand and also the world's population, and that there are more immediate concerns in their heads.
Yes, exactly, and and you'll never win the argument, no matter how logical, with Mike Hosking. So you're right, and some of it is we kind of have to be better at actually saying probably China is actually probably going to end up saving the world, remarkably, given that it's sort of been cast as the great villain. But it's their solar panels that are driving the transition to decarbonisation. Air pollution was so bad in those major Chinese cities 10 years ago. Actually, if you go to some of those cities now, they've got cleaner air than some parts of Europe, which have been working on it for longer. So there is a colossal transition that is occurring, and we're kind of on the periphery of that kind of wave, and we're receiving some of the benefit of that transition without necessarily doing a great deal to drive it ourselves. But the fact is that the economics now are getting to the point where the household economics are compelling. Like if you swap out your internal combustion engine car for an electric car, and you swap out your gas hob and your gas hot water and your gas central heating, assuming you've got those things, and you whack a solar panel on the roof and you have an overnight battery, then you will save thousands of dollars from your household energy bill, thousands of dollars. And that kind of microeconomic effect then translates up into neighbourhoods, cities, regions, and the economy as a whole. If you look at our balance of trade deficit, the vast majority of that gap is the import of fossil fuels. If we didn't have to import fossil fuels, we would have almost perfect trade equilibrium with other countries.
And that's a really good point. And as an aside, I do have solar and I've got an EV, James.
I bet you do.
Yes.
You spent enough time hanging out with Tim Grosser that he eventually got to you.
But in this retreat of politics, what we're seeing is economics asserting itself where politics is unable to.
Yes.
Where actually it's working because it makes sense fiscally. And I'm looking at Veronica now as the economist amongst us. are we worrying too much about the political consensus? Is the sort of thing that's just going to happen anyway because firms are making the decisions because they know what's coming?
Well, I think firms are also making the decisions because their shareholders and consumers are demanding those changes because of their perceptions of what is likely to happen with climate change. So I think there are drivers of the economics which are then feeding back into what makes sense for consumers to buy.
So we don't have to worry then?
I think we need to keep the pressure on.
Because, yeah, I mean, if Fonterra is going to change out all its boilers for electrics because its consumers are telling it to, then we can all scream politically that that's brilliant or woke or whatever you want to do it, but it's not going to change that it's happening.
But they're not just doing it with their vehicle fleet. I mean, Fonterra is trying to decarbonise 30% of their emissions because their customers are saying so. And on the other side of it, you've got politicians and, you know, various industry lobby groups who are trying to reduce the target or withdraw from Paris or whatever have you. But you've got our largest export business in the agricultural sector moving in the precise opposite direction from the politicians and from the kind of industry lobby groups. So, and that is an industry. I mean, they're clearly not doing that because of political pressure.
So if decarbonisation makes economic sense and the businesses are doing it, is the political debate over for adapting, for responding to climate change?
Penny's not allowed to say because she's a neutral public servant. I think, no, you know, because otherwise you would say, does politics matter at all? And I do think it does. And you can see that the narrative kind of that we're in. I mean, the fact that this session is framed as, you know, what economic trade-offs are we willing to make to save the environment rather than flipping it on its head is kind of a sign of the times. And that can take hold. And I think signalling does make a real difference. And when it comes to biodiversity loss and climate change, we're up against a clock. It's not a linear thing where it's like, well, if we just don't save it today, we can always save it tomorrow. It's like, no, the consequences of inaction reach a point where you eventually get more and more catastrophic results. So even a dampening effect slows action and increases the risk that you cross those thresholds where you're faced with various forms of social and economic and environmental collapse.
So there is a role for the Green Party still, is what you're saying, even though you've retired.
I'm not a member of any political party, Stephen. Yeah.
Let's then move to other parts of the environment, because this is the environment as a whole, not just climate change. And why not then, given that we have Penny here, talk a little bit more about the challenge of biodiversity, the challenge of protection of the New Zealand environment, and what I see is the completely mammoth mammoth task in front of not just Doc, but anybody in that space. And I want to be a bit provocative, because I often think that when the balloon goes up financially or fiscally, Doc tends to sort of go into a bit of a crouch and do what it can and not share too widely with the other kids. And there's lots of other kids that want to help save the New Zealand environment. And Doc's traditional approach is to say, well, we've got to look after our people first. And it's been great to know you philanthropists and everything else, but, you know, we've got to feed our people. Is that your approach at the moment, Penny?
Oh, Stephen, you're so out of date.
Oh. That's good. Somebody had to say it.
So we've got a big job to do, and we can't do it alone. And part of the reason that we've been focused on our conservation investment approach is because we want to be able to demonstrate to business, philanthropists, what are investable packages of things that we can't cover through our baseline that they could invest in. So we're launching a major Mobilising for Nature campaign later this year. We're already getting a lot of interest from corporates and philanthropists in that. Also, you know, you saw what's happened with predator free. So that call to action has mobilised New Zealanders throughout the country to trap, to care about what happens with that next. And I think that's, in terms of what I was talking about with the Rees Valley, 80 voluntary groups in the lower South Island did trapping to the extent that it was safe for us to put one of our most vulnerable birds back into the mainland, and where we think that we can grow them to having 500 there. We couldn't have done that without New Zealanders, philanthropists and businesses like Fulton Hogan and Real NZ who've been with us the whole way through. So we are incredibly focused on working with others, and we won't get the results that we need to unless we do that.
Okay. I say that actually because I don't think I'm completely out of date. Because I do get a lot of those predator-free groups ringing up saying, they struggle with DOC. What do you make of that? Because you must hear that as well as you go around, that sometimes they think that they're not wanted or needed.
So I think in this role I hear some of that, and what I also hear from a lot of those groups is just how much DOC is focused on collaborating with people and trying to scale things. So it's a mix.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
What do you think, James? I mean, is this a job for the government, or is this a job for everybody?
It's a job for everybody. Absolutely. I mean, you started off by saying, DOC looks after a third of the country's landmass, which is true, but they also do it on less than 1% of the government's budget. So that tells you sort of just how misallocated our kind of resources. But even if they did it on a proportional basis, it's still, the task is enormous. So I'm a very big fan of crowding in philanthropic and private capital to try and resolve these problems. And kind of people who know me know that when I was a minister, I was kind of obsessed with trying to make the market settings work. The kind of driving force was to say, well, there are many multiples of private capital than there are of public capital around. So how do you create really well-functioning markets that are attractive for private capital on a commercial basis, the same basis that they would get in any other industry, in order to kind of make this a sustainable solution? And I kind of fundamentally believe that until we can make saving the planet as commercially viable as destroying it, we will just continue to destroy it, right? So I think that is a really important piece of work, and getting that to work is actually a public policy question, and does require government to take a lead. And it was a great source of frustration to me, the inertia of government. And I know that wasn't unique to our government, but I do think that we could have done a lot more around that.
I'll bring Veronica in here, do we try and do too much? Because the mere fact that DOC is in charge of 30% of our land mass suggests that we have created a Herculean task for any organisation. I mean, we've put a lot of land in DOC, which could arguably be looked after by other people. So what are your thoughts, Veronica? And the other, just related to that, things like ecosystem services, which people try to make as part of the RMA stuff, and where trade-offs occur, and you get the environmental fundamentalists, if I put it that way, and I'm not including James in that category, but you get those that say, oh no, any trade-offs are impossible.
Yes, it is a huge task. There's a huge amount of our land is administered by DOC. And I think it's worthwhile asking the question, are other entities better suited to manage some of it? And that's a legitimate policy question. But I think also going to James's point, making it commercially attractive is also important. We can't just rely on volunteer groups going and setting out rat poison as we do at our holiday house at Lake Tarawera. We've got stretch of about 400 metres of shoreline that we poison the rats, and there's lots of bird life. So, but you can't rely on that sort of volunteers. You need to scale it up to make it more attractive as a commercial deal.
So what does that look like? So how do we do that? I mean, what's in it for a firm?
Well,
Okay, get your spreadsheets out. We're about to do the design part.
Well, look, we have a more mature market around sequestering carbon than we do around biodiversity, right? But you are starting to see around the world markets for biodiversity protection and enhancement, which are being driven. I mean, I don't think that there's a single. Well, actually, that's not true. The UK has a sort of a mandatory regime in place where, if you're doing a development, you have to buy a biodiversity offset for that, equal to, I think, 105%. So it's actually, if I'm removing a hectare, for development, then I have to add a hectare plus X, and that's driving. And then they've got a kind of an offset market, a biodiversity offset market, which is driving huge change in the UK and restoring areas, a lot of which were actually deforested and denuded thousands of years ago. So other than that, I don't know of a single kind of compliance market around biodiversity nature in the world, but it is moving in that direction. And a lot of the lessons that have been learned from the carbon markets are now being applied to biodiversity as well. So I think that you will see an increase in both compliance and voluntary markets. And in carbon, the voluntary markets and the compliance markets are sort of getting to a point where they're merging. And if you look at the predator-free challenge, that's kind of $10 to $20 billion sort of task, at least. Very few outfits in New Zealand have got that kind of money available, but globally it's a tiny, right? So if we can work out ways to tap into kind of international carbon and biodiversity markets, then I think it's all to play for.
How are you folk thinking about that?
So I think there's a couple of things that we're thinking about is, are there, how do we enable different ways of looking after things? So, for example, with our visitor network, we can currently afford 70% of it. So we're looking at what do we stay in and run, what do we partner with others to do. So, for example, Backcountry Trust running, helping us look after some of our really remote huts, and what do we just get out of, have others looking at. And then in terms of the land itself, we're starting to look at, are there different ways of achieving what we need to achieve with others? So, for example, in the Rokumaras, we've got 2 iwi who are doing a lot of the work to do the predator and browser control. We support them with it, but essentially they're leading that work, it's the first time we've been able to get 1080 in there, so they're getting the social licence and the investment to do it. And then you look further south with people like the Wapiti Foundation, where they're bringing in game hunters and they're paying, but they're reinvesting that in what they do environmentally, and we're getting really good environmental results, and they're helping us run it. So we're looking at, in terms of that wide land that we're responsible for, what can we do, but where are there others who can really do more to help us get there with it. So we've just got to be a bit more lateral about how we get more done.
And this might not be a question that you can answer, but unconstrained thinking. Should we be allowing DOC to effectively transfer ownership of Schedule 4 land, for example, for the sorts of biodiversity trade-offs that you're talking about? So if a developer in, Hamilton is wanting to develop 20 hectares or 50 hectares of land around this city, should they be able to take on both responsibility and ownership for some stewardship land, whether it's here or down the west coast, and take responsibility for you're looking at me in a dismayed, horrified manner, James.
Well, I was going to correct you. I am an environmental fundamentalist, which is why open to just about any solution that's going to fix the problem, right? But I don't think that you need to transfer ownership. So DOC has a concession program. You know, you can stay in luxury lodges in the DOC estate. There are coal mines in the DOC estate, for God's sake.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, we actually have existing commercial operations on conservation land. And, you know, at the moment, the government's got out a RFI on afforestation on DOC land, with a quite bonkers openness to more pine trees. But that aside, the idea is that people are sort of willing to essentially run a sort of some form of afforestation concession. So I do think that you could do something where you said, you know, yes, if you were to do an offset against a development in Hamilton, you know, you could look after a section of the DOC estate, and that would be very helpful, given the anemic resources that we devote to DOC.
Mm-hmm. Veronica.
Yes, I agree. I mean, we've just come back from Botswana, which was really interesting because it's a national park, but has concessions for private operators to operate, and you know, numbers of animals and things going up. Now, different situation from New Zealand, but the principle is the same. So I don't see why you couldn't manage something without necessarily transferring ownership.
Do we think then, because we've got an RMA reform coming up, which is effectively land use legislation in this country, do we think that, and you probably can't ask Penny this so much, but we'll give it a go, do we think that that these sorts of biodiversity services should be more explicitly catered to in our planning and consenting legislation for land use? And is this something that's on the radar of the government, to any of your knowledge, including Penny?
Yes, I don't know whether it is on the government's radar, but it would make absolute sense for biodiversity services to be included because they're so fundamental to life. So they obviously have a value, which is, as I seem to recall when the RMA was first being introduced, they used terms like intrinsic value, which kind of begs the question of what is that value, but being more precise about what that value is in terms of things like biodiversity services or ecological services makes it much clearer what you're talking about.
I mean, I don't know what the government's thinking in either a literal or figurative sense. I think, you know, we are doing RMA reform, but we've been doing RMA reform since 1991.
Good things take time.
So, you know, I think it does present an opportunity. I happen to agree, you know, when we were in government, I actually agreed with the kind of main point that the National Party made at the time when they were in opposition about it would be kind of cleaner if you had a Planning Act and an Environmental Protection Act, you know, and kind of, you know, where we ended up was a sort of a melange of the two. I have no idea if we'll kind of get there. I suspect coalition dynamics will mean that it either doesn't happen, or if it does happen, then the next government will simply change it again. So I think it'll be a while before we see any kind of stability in that sort of area. But, you know, if we were to look at other countries who are getting more functional results than the ones that we're getting, then simply mimicking them wouldn't be a bad way to start.
I'm just sitting here thinking that if the Greens and the current coalition agreed on separating the RMA into a Planning Act and an Environment Effects Act, then that would be fairly durable.
Well, you know, I think from memory, Eugenie Sage was on the record as having said that was when we were in government with Labor at the time, that our preferred...
But David went down quite a different path.
Yeah, sure. You know, but and then the next question is, okay, what's in those acts?
Yeah, well, that's probably where it gets a bit more exciting.
That's right. Yeah, it does. And that, you know, so it's not just a kind of a high level sort of.
We'll agree on this part. Yes.
Yeah.
So Penny, is that sort of, without sharing any confidences that you can't share, is that the sort of conversations that are happening?
So I think the sort of conversation that you're raising, there'll be much more of a conversation around that in the future. And I think the things that we're really interested in is, I think we have got to get much clearer on what the priorities are for biodiversity. I think we've had, when I started at DOC, no one could tell me what the biodiversity priorities were. We're just trying to focus on everything. So we've had done a lot of work so that we're much clearer on, where it really matters, and in terms of the sequence of things that you need to do, what that looks like. I think we've got to be much clearer on the standards that need to be met through that RMA process. And then I think the other thing that we're really focused on, so as you know, officials can do a long-term insights briefing. The one that DOC is, so that's where it's some more future-looking thinking. It doesn't need to go through your minister. You consult publicly on it. So what we're looking at this time is how you could value nature better in government decision-making, and really starting to look at what are the places you'd have to hardwire that into, because it's not just in resource management decisions, it's across the board. So really look forward to those of you in the audience engaging with that work as we do it.
Well, actually, one of the questions from the audience is, you're a commercial organisation or even a non-commercial organisation, and they can't see any economic justification for engaging in this stuff. There's no model, and I think we've chewed over the land development side. That's one option. But if you're not in land development and you're going about your business and you'd like to contribute, but actually there's nothing in it for you, are there models that can make it, to James's earlier point about economic incentives to do it without just paying money, I suppose?
Yeah, well, I mean, if there's literally nothing in it, then there's no particular reason to expect an organisation would make a contribution or want to. But there are voluntary biodiversity markets and initiatives happening around the world. A lot of it's driven by your kind of large global corporates rather than the kind of smaller end of town, and really that is, I think, a combination of kind of consumer pushback against the kind of general carnage that we're causing, and some of it is, in some cases, the kind of personal passions of the leadership of those organisations and their shareholders. And a kind of a growing sense that actually, if we kind of spoil our own nest, then, let me put it this way, in a 3-degree warmed world, how much is your money actually worth? And the answer is nothing. So if you've got any kind of long-term view, then it kind of makes sense to get involved in this, and you can build kind of brand and marketing kind of competitive advantage off the back of it. So I do think that there are reasons for companies to get involved on a voluntary basis, and the evidence for that is that they already are. It's just not happening at the kind of scale or speed that we, kind of collectively need. But I do think that opportunity exists. I do think that there are things that governments can do that would make it easier for them to do that, and to kind of coordinate the action and so on.
There's a couple of questions here about forestry, and you've all, I assume, traversed this debate a little bit, which is carbon sinks, but the effect on farmland and the effect on communities. Is there an emerging consensus of doing that a bit differently? Because for a while there, it was the solution, just plant pine trees in as many places as you can, and naturally enough, there's pushback from both a biodiversity perspective, but also from a community perspective. So what's the answer now? Do we plant native forest? Does that work, or is forestry not part of the answer for climate change?
So
Stump the Brains Trust, brilliant.
Oh no! I feel like I've been doing a lot of talking, so
Yep.
It won't surprise you. I learn I've got opinions.
So I think the thing that I'm finding really interesting at the moment is, so our native forests store 1.8 billion tonnes of carbon, and what we're starting to see is we've got a range of corporates and philanthropists who are saying we're really interested in how we protect those carbon stores and wanting to do some work to look at the connection between predator control and carbon. So we're really interested in what would you need to do in terms of the science and the policy mechanism so that you could demonstrate the connection between those things. So that we're starting to get a lot of people coming into the Ministry for the Environment and DOC to start looking at that. So I think protecting our carbon sinks in the forests that we've got, particularly in the South Island, really big commercial play there over the next 5 to 10 years. So we're getting a lot of that. I think in terms of wilding pines, I used to run biosecurity. I think we have got one of the best economic cases in government that demonstrate the impact that they have and the cost to
pests,
our country in terms of wilding pines.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I just think we don't want to get into anything that's going to increase that impact.
Okay.
There is a growing consensus that just planting more pine trees is a very poor solution, and it comes from a sort of myopic, short carbon, we just need to sequester what we can today,
yeah.
Because they grow quickly, right? The fundamental problem, I think, as everybody knows, everybody wants more native afforestation, but it takes decades for those forests to mature to the point that they're really soaking up the kind of levels of carbon. They have a really long carbon cycle, 800 years carbon cycle, so they're way better than pine forests will ever be, which have a multi-decade carbon cycle. Not to mention the kind of water erosion, fire risks and so on that monocrop pine forests have. So, absolutely. The problem that you've got then, though, is if you say, well, let's stop planting pine forests and let's start planting natives, is what do you do about the carbon dioxide that you're emitting today, which needs soaking up today because it is having an effect today. And, you can't wait until 2070 for those forests to, because it'll be way too late by then. So, it's not going to...
Genetically engineered native forests, that would seem to be the answer.
Well...
He said frivolously.
Well, I know there are people working on that. And actually, given the effect of climate change on species loss of forests as well, we're going to need to do something to kind of shore up those forests. But the best thing that you can do is actually just stop putting the pollution in the atmosphere in the first place. But given that we don't particularly want to do that, we need to kind of work out what else to do.
Well, we do, but to your earlier point, we want to do that next year.
We want it to happen. Yeah. We just don't want to do anything to make it happen. In the same way that we really want to be like Singapore, but without doing anything that Singapore does to make
With
Singapore...
2 minutes 41 to go, James opened up a whole new area of discussion.
Yeah.
There's a few questions here which, again, unconstrained thinking, and I'm going to ask Veronica this to put the economist hat on. These people are saying, let's just sell some of the stock Schedule 4 land that's being used as farmland and give the money back to DOC to do a better job with their core conservation land. What's the argument against that?
Well, I think it goes back to James's point, that if DOC has to reforest with native plants, it's going to take a long time. So that would be an issue. But is DOC the best manager? Are there other managers? Iwi, for example, would be another question. So it wouldn't necessarily be give the land to DOC.
I just think you've got too much to do. I've always thought that. Penny can't answer that. James.
Well, I think we've traversed it. They do have too much to do, but the answer to that isn't to shrink the natural estate. Right, well, it's to crowd in support onto the natural estate to say, well, how do we go?
But there's a philosophical discussion about how much land the Crown should own. In terms of, take the West Coast for example, huge amount of Schedule 4 land, which really only ended up in DOC because of the breakup of the Forestry service.
Yeah,
that was it, and it's not got particularly high conservation value as it sits.
So that stewardship land is about 9%. It is public conservation land. Actually, quite a lot of it does have high conservation value. I think what I'd add is with some of the changes we're looking to make to conservation legislation, we are asking the question about whether it should be easier to dispose certain types of land. So we are looking at that. And then I think there's a range of other things that we need to do as well. So again, through that consultation we're doing, we're also looking at should we be charging more at particular places like other countries do, Aoraki Mount Cook, for example, and then invest that in conservation. So I think given the urgency, we've got to improve biodiversity. We've got to look at all of the sorts of things that are being raised and get on with it, or we're going to be in a position where we won't have the forests or the species that we've enjoyed, and I think that has a major economic impact on the country.
One last question, which will take just a yes/no answer, and I think I know how it's going to play. Somebody here said, should the visitor levy be hypothecated to DOC?
Yes!
Well, that was not unexpected. James?
As you well know, there's no such thing as a yes or no answer. When we were in government and we brought it in, my argument that it should be hypothecated to predator-free, which operates on both the DOC estate and on the private natural estate.
Actually, I'm pretty supportive of that. Veronica, should it be hypothecated to DOC?
No, because it actually is currently used to fund other things. If you go down south and you go to these small towns which have marvellous public toilets, that's
and
what's being funded out of.
Economists are always against hypothecation, but
the Treasury's always against hypothecation, and Veronica never worked for the Treasury, so I'm not quite sure why.
Yes, she did.
Oh, did you? Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, Treasury is allergic to hypothecation.
Yeah.
Look, we've run out of time. Thank you very, very much for your contributions. I hope it's been a useful conversation. There's actually plenty of questions we didn't get to. One about Hamilton's canopy and how much the city is spending on biodiversity over the next 3 years. So Paula will talk to you afterwards. But can I thank Penny Nelson, James Shaw and Veronica Jacobsen. Cheers.